Okay, looks like we're going to get started here. Thank you so much for joining us today for another WOW webinar. My name is Nora Luongo, and I am on the internal marketing team here at Whereoware. Just to get a couple housekeeping items out of the way, we will be sending the slides, the webinar recording, and a responsive email checklist out in an email either today or tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. If you are on Twitter, feel free to tweet along with us with the hashtag WowWebinar. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to write them to us in the questions box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dan and Chris, who are going to kick off this Mobile Email Design 101 webinar.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks everybody on the webinar here for joining us. My name is Dan Caro. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Operations at Whereoware. A little bit about me. I've been working in email marketing for the past 12 years. I've been specializing in behavior-based marketing and digital strategy. But for the last 5 years, I've been focused on mobile design and responsive email specifically. And also, in line with mobile design and responsive emails, I've also been working with the team here to develop a better process for coding responsive emails. So today I hope to show what I've learned over that period of time with mobile design, with responsive emails, and pass it along to all you good folks on the phone. Like Nora said, you can tweet at us. My Twitter handle is on the screen right now at dcaro12. And if you do tweet at us, just make sure to use that hashtag WowWebinar, so we can follow along with any questions or comments that you have as we go through the webinar. Now I'm going to pass it over to Chris so he can introduce himself.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, like Dan mentioned, my name is Chris Grush. I'm Digital Marketing Manager here at Whereoware. I've been more focused on design and development of email for our clients here for the past 2 years. So I hope to bring a kind of technical background and so kind of share some of my experiences with mobile email design specifically and be able to pass it along to you guys as well. You can also tweet me at Chris Grush, and like Dan mentioned already, use that WOW webinar hashtag, and we'll be sure to answer any questions after the webinar today.
So if this is your first Whereoware webinar that you've attended, just a little bit of background on our company. We're a digital agency based in Chantilly, Virginia, which is just outside Washington, D.C. We've been in business for the last 17 years. On our client marketing team, we specialize in automated one-to-one emails that are also mobile responsive. We also have a great development team, which focuses their attention on building awesome personalized websites. And then in addition to those two teams, we also have search, mobile app, and data integration teams as well. So that's generally the focus of our agency here in Chantilly. And just a little bit about our clients. We work primarily with B2B and B2C e-commerce and services companies. And as you can see from our logo slide here, we work with a wide range of different types of companies that can go from B2C, gift and home decor, to B2B services companies. And there's a huge wide swath of companies that we work with. So that's a little bit about us. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into the content. We got a lot of great content for you today. So first off, we're going to start with who cares about mobile email? Like, why is mobile email important? Why should you care about it? Second, we're going to talk about designing for mobile, and we're going to look at scalable emails and responsive emails and the differences between those two. So which one of those should you pick when choosing a type of mobile design? Next, we're going to look at what you can do with responsive. So if you've chosen to go with responsive emails, what can you do with responsive emails, and how are those different than regular desktop emails or scalable emails? Then Chris is going to dive into responsive support. Where are responsive emails supported? Like, what email clients support them? Then we're going to dive into coding responsive emails. And today we're not going to provide a training on coding responsive emails. We're just going to give the basics. Like, this is Mobile Design 101. We just want you to walk away with the basic elements of coding a responsive email. And then finally, we're going to close with a software tool that we've developed to code responsive email templates within minutes. So if you're joining us for the first time, definitely stick around to the end because there's a lot of good content at the end of today's webinar. So first off, we're going to start talking about who cares about mobile and why is it important.
So I think this quote from Litmus is a really good example of why mobile should be important for you. And what we're getting here is that more than half of consumers are now engaging with their emails on their mobile device. So if you're not optimizing your emails for mobile, you're potentially losing over half of your email subscribers to a bad user experience.
Now, I just want to pull up this chart from Litmus, and Litmus has been tracking email opens for a long time. So on this chart, they went back for the last 6 years. I just want to point out how opens on mobile devices has changed a lot in those 6 years. So specifically, I want to point out the time period between 2011 and 2013. You saw a massive jump in the amount of opens that were occurring on a mobile device. Back in 2011, it was less than 10%. In 2013, that jumped to being the predominant medium that email opens were occurring on. And then in the time between 2013 and today, that jumped to over half. So 54% of emails are now being opened on a mobile device. So basically, the key takeaway here is if you don't have a mobile strategy, you probably need one, or at the very least, you need to look at where your email opens are occurring, like what devices they're occurring on. And more than likely, you're going to see that mobile devices, if they're not the primary medium that they're opening on, they're a very significant part of your device opens.
So from that same Litmus report that we pulled the original quote from, on top of how many emails are being read on mobile, over half of people said they'd actually unsubscribe from brands simply because it wasn't responsive. So you could have the best, most engaging content, but your subscribers will unsubscribe or in some cases delete your email if they are having a bad user experience. It's as if customers are now expecting emails to be responsive, and if it's not, it could have a negative implication on your brand and your company as a whole.
So what we did on this next slide is we basically took a compilation of a lot of things that we were seeing in desktop emails, and we put them all into one really bad desktop-only design and tried to show what it would look like if it was opened on a mobile device. So in this case, we rendered it on Outlook web app. So what you're seeing here is a couple different things. So first off, the text is really small to read. It's really difficult to read. So in this case, you're going to have your users having to pinch the content in order to read the text that's in the email. Secondly, you have really small links that would be difficult to tap, and this is particularly challenging when you have multiple links grouped together. And so it's difficult for somebody with the tip of their finger to be able to tap on one link versus another. And it's something that Chris and I like to call fat fingering links. You want to avoid that. Next, you have content that rolls off the page. It goes to the right of the page. And then again, you're having users having to swipe to read all of the content. That's not a good user experience. And then finally, at this point, you probably have users who are going to go use the click to view in browser to have an easier time interacting with your email. So that's another thing you want to avoid. You want to make the email experience really easy. You want to have a one-column format that's easy just to swipe down and read all of the content in your email. So next we're going to dive into designing for mobile devices and whether the scalable approach is the right approach for you or the responsive mobile responsive approach is the right approach.
And when we're trying to figure out what that right approach for you is, we want to make sure we understand what both scalable and responsive versions actually look like and what those are going to entail. So the first option, the scalable, or what we like to call a mobile-friendly design, that's going to be a very simple one-version email that's going to use a single column design using only mobile-friendly techniques. So it's going to scale your email down from what it looks like on the desktop to fit the width of your phone. And like I mentioned, it's using just those mobile-friendly techniques. So it is a good solution, but we are kind of limited on what we can do with the scalable design.
So just an example of a scalable design. We pulled up this example from Dot & Bow. And on the left side, we have the desktop version. On the right side, we have the mobile version. And what you can see here is that it is the same exact email on the desktop and the mobile version. And so the scalable approach is a good approach if you don't have responsive coding skills or you don't have anyone on your team with responsive coding skills. Basically what scalable is taking a version that will render well on mobile, but it ends up being the same version as the desktop version. The key things that you want to consider here is having large images, large text, a big button, and then for the images that you can use a grid style like is shown in the example on the screen, or you can just have them all stacked on top of each other in a one-column format.
So now we can see that scalable has its limitations. We want to try to figure out what responsive is. And for responsive, what you can see here is you're going to actually have multiple versions of that same email. In the image here, you can see on the desktop and the laptop, we're going to see a consistent view. But when we go down to the tablet and even down to the phone, that layout is actually adjusting to the screen size it's being opened on. And more specifically, the 3-column that we have on the desktop goes down to a 2-column on the tablet, which then goes down to a single column on your mobile device. And we're able to do that using CSS media queries to adjust the size and format of that email. So your layout can change and your tables and images can resize, content can be stacked on top of each other, sections can be hidden or displayed depending on what you're trying to view. And we're using those breakpoints to target the actual screen size and the device to figure out what the best layout and solution is going to be for that particular device.
So right here we want to show 2 examples from our clients here at Whereoware. The example on the left side of the screen is DEI. The example on the right is an example from Curry & Company. So these are just 2 basic examples of what responsive emails look like. The key elements here is that you have logos that expand and get bigger and fill up the entire width of the screen. And then you have images that stack below that. So it's really easy to interact with all of the content in a simple 1-column format. So as you're scrolling down the screen, you're seeing all of that content show up in one single column. So it avoids what I was talking about in the bad desktop example, where you have to pinch or you have to scroll or you have to swipe over. It's simple to scroll down in a 1-column format and easily interact with all of the content in a responsive email.
So with responsive, not only do we see a better user experience, but we can actually see some improvement in reporting numbers. And YesMail found that companies that make that switch from standard desktop to a responsive design actually see a higher click rate. So click to open rates were actually 40% higher for brands that send exclusively responsive emails. So if you don't have a great mobile experience, you're potentially losing out on a big opportunity for your subscribers engaging with your emails.
And another stat that we have here is that at this point, 75% of email marketers are using responsive design on a regular basis with their marketing emails. So the one key takeaway here is don't be part of the 25%. If you're part of the 25%, it means that your fellow email marketers out there are leaving you behind. Like, they have better mobile experiences than you necessarily have, so it puts you behind the curve as far as email is concerned. So it's time to develop a mobile strategy. Whether it's scalable, whether it's responsive, it's good to have some kind of solution to the mobile dilemma. So now we're going to talk about what you can actually do with responsive email.
So let's try to define what responsive email is so we can try to help figure out what we can do with it. So we're defining responsive design as a combination of media queries, fluid grids, and fluid images, which aim to provide the optimal viewing experience across various platforms. And this was a definition by Litmus back in 2013. So that really should open your ears to think, if this was defined back in 2013 and you're still not optimizing for a mobile experience, you're certainly well behind the curve. Responsive design has been around for a long time, so if your emails aren't responsive, don't solely rely on those specific devices. So the large part of responsiveness actually relies on your email clients you're reading the email on, so we want to make sure that we're actually keeping up to date with what responsive is, what we can do, and who's actually going to be supporting it.
So just to dive in real quick on the elements of how a responsive email changes between the desktop version and the mobile version. So here we have another example of one of our clients, MudPie. So the first thing is content gets resized, and when we say resizing content, we're talking about image sizes, text sizes, and tables. So the first example I want to show here is that the logo I was talking about when we first showed the two responsive examples. The MudPie Market logo in the desktop version is small and in the left corner, and when it moves over to the mobile version, it expands to the full width of the screen, and it gets much bigger, so it's easier to recognize the brand that it's coming from. Next, you have showing and hiding of content. So this is optimizing it for smaller devices. So here you can see on the desktop version, we have a navigation bar right below the logo. And if you can see over on the mobile version, that navigation bar goes away entirely. It doesn't actually go away. All we're doing here is moving it down to the bottom of the email. So if you scroll down the whole email, you're going to see that that navigation bar just gets stacked at the bottom of the email. But for the purposes of the prime real estate at the top of the email, it's not just a cluster of small links that are difficult to tap. It actually gets moved to the bottom of the email. Then you have everything stacking into a one-column layout. So in this case, we've got additional product images down at the bottom of this email that are in two columns. We're just stacking those images into a one-column format. So like I was talking about before, as you scroll down the email, you're going to nicely and easily see all of the content stacked in a one-column format, which makes it easy to interact with on a mobile device.
And by now, I'm sure you can kind of see a common theme for what responsive emails are going to look like. So we end up moving the navigation and housekeeping items down, so we don't end up fat fingering those navigation items. Our grid layouts are stacking into a linear layout. We're adding some white space and some padding to make sure we're increasing the readability. And our call to action certainly do need to be up front and center above the fold, so you're able to click it very easily. And for this example here, we see that those techniques being applied again. We have our call to action above the fold. Our headline is nice and big. We've added some padding to adjust to the style here. And then our two-column layout actually goes into a one-column layout.
So just to add on to what Chris is saying, so here we have the two product images at the bottom of the email. And as you can see, like I was talking about in the previous example, that is all stacking into a one-column layout where anything that's in multiple columns gets stacked on top of each other, so it's easy to scroll down and see all of that content on a mobile device. So now we're going to look at a plow and hearth example, and you're going to see a lot of things that we're talking about. It's happening across multiple emails. So first off, we've got the small logo on the desktop version. It gets expanded to be full width. We've got our navigation on the desktop version, which disappears and gets moved to the bottom of the email. And then we've got all of our images, including our product images, which go full width and get stacked on top of each other. So a lot of these things are going to be similar across a lot of mobile responsive emails. There's a lot of different elements that can get added in as well. You can do email carousels and video within email, but it's just a matter of having it render in a way that is friendly for a mobile device. It's easy to interact with if you're viewing it on a smaller screen.
one thing that we want to try to drive home with you is that you certainly need to keep in consideration of having just a big, beautiful button. We don't want anybody to have confusion as what they need to do to take action on this particular email, and we certainly don't want it to make it difficult for them to take that action. So you can see here in this example, we have a really large button. It's got enough padding and spacing around the button. We can see it, it's very clear, and it's going to be easy for us to click when it's actually on that mobile device.
And just like Chris was saying, one of the keys to good mobile design is a very simple design. Start simple, but you want to incorporate big images, big text, and honestly, like minimal text. Most of your users are going to interact with your email for 2 seconds or less. And when I'm saying this, I'm talking about swiping and scrolling between all of the emails in their inbox. There's not a lot of time that they're going to spend specifically with your email, but just make sure to get the point across in that short period of time. So to do that, a simple design, minimal text, a single clear call to action. So in this case, we've got one of those big, beautiful buttons that Chris was talking about. And then just clear and concise content. You don't need to write a novel in your emails. If you have a lot of content, you can save that content for the landing page, which Chris is going to talk about on the next slide. Keep it concise in the email. Like, your goal in the email is to capture the user's attention, get the user to interact with your email, and then click on the call to action to go to the next screen or the landing page or wherever they're going next.
So like Dan mentioned, we also want to keep in mind what's going to happen when that user actually interacts with your email and they leave that email. So for this example from Colonial Candle, we see that our email, our enter to win, shop now button, we wanted to make sure that when they actually hit that shop now, what's going to happen when they hit the website. So we can see that the landing page that they're presented with is a nice, responsive landing page. We've got our navigation and our logo up top. It's nice and condensed. Our images are going to be scaled 100% and easy to read. The text on top of it is easy to read, and our buttons are actually going to stack. They're nice and large, easy for you to understand, easy for you to click, and it just continues on with that good user experience after they leave your email.
And another thing that's important here is if you've developed a great mobile experience on email, you want to make sure that the landing page experience also matches that great experience that you have in your email. If you have an uneven experience, like the email experience is great, but then you don't have a responsive website or a responsive landing page, it still makes for a not so great user experience because they're going from a great experience in the email to a not so great one on the landing page. So you want to make sure those things sync up. So here I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, and he's going to talk about what email clients support responsive email.
So we briefly mentioned already that responsive support is not 100% there for all of our email clients. And we found that with Litmus, when Gmail came out to support media queries, that brought us up to over 75% of email clients are now supporting responsive design. So although across the board it is very good, we still have that 25% that we need to keep into consideration. We need to make sure that we're staying up to date with who's actually supporting it, and we're going to go into that on the next slide here. So for Campaign Monitor, we see a very clear chart as to see who's actually supporting our emails. And the email clients that aren't supporting, you're going to see a lot of them are going to be Outlook, and we also have Yahoo Mail there. So Outlook has been pretty far behind the curve, even in their new Outlook web app. It's still not going to be responsive, so it ends up being just a scaled down version of the desktop version. But like I mentioned, that's just about 25% of the email client support. We do have a ton of people still supporting, like on iPhone. Now we have Gmail, Android 4 is still kind of behind the curve there. But when we break it down, we want to understand why they're not being supported. And although, like you see here, Outlook is supporting the style and the link or in the head tag, those media queries aren't actually going to be supported. Those will end up being stripped or overlooked, and those classes won't end up being applied. And a good example of this is this Hotlook email example we have. So this is the same email on the same phone, just opened up in 2 different email client apps. So on the left side, this is the native Apple Mail app. The logo up top is scaled to 100% across the top. Our images are stacked on top of each other. They are going 100% across. But when we open it up again in the Outlook app, you can see it's just a scaled down version of the desktop. And those links and text are going to be much smaller, not easy for you to read or click, and it's going to make you have to pinch in and zoom. So we just need to make sure we're keeping up to date, because although Outlook doesn't support it today, that doesn't mean in the future they could come out to then start supporting these media queries. So we want to make sure that we're staying up to date, because these old coding techniques that we use could become obsolete at any moment. So we just want to make sure we're keeping up to date, know what we're actually doing, and certainly having a better understanding of which email clients your readers are opening on.
So the next section we're going to dive into is how to code a responsive email. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is not a training on how to code responsive email. If you want a training on coding responsive email, there's a lot of great resources out there on the web that you can look into. Basically, like so this is Mobile Design 101. If you're just looking to learn at like how to get started with responsive and what are the key elements that need to be included in a responsive email, that's what we hope to tackle today. Obviously, in this 1-hour webinar, we don't have time to do a full responsive design training, but here, like in this section, you're going to learn the basics. You're going to learn about media queries, and you're going to learn how to build in the elements that you would need to do a responsive email.
So to try to make it easy to understand, we've tried to break down responsive email coding into these 4 sections. And so Stan and I have often heard from our clients, like, what's that line of code that I can add to my emails to end up making this responsive? And that's just not the case. So we're going to have a couple of different steps here to make sure we're following, a couple of different best practices to actually make this work. And the first step, like we mentioned before, is we need to create a media query. And that query can be seen as the conditional rule set that needs to be met in order for our responsive styles to apply. And those styles are held within a class, which is sitting within that media query. And those classes we're actually going to append to some of the HTML elements in our code. And lastly, we just need to make sure we have the appropriate meta tags that's communicating with the browser or email client to expect responsive design in your email. So what exactly is a media query? We're going to define a media query as a set of conditional statements that target HTML elements or classes and override existing styles in your email. And on the right, you can see what a media query looks like. We open up the media query, we define the environment, and we have that conditional rule of a max width of 600 pixels. Our classes are going to be nested inside that with our styles appended to those. And essentially what this does is, in basic terms, if the screen size is less than or equal to X, which is that 600 pixel rule, perform Y, which is going to be our classes and our styles appended within those classes. And I also want to reiterate, these media queries are not supported everywhere. So these will only be applying to the email clients that actually accept and support media queries.
Which, to reiterate, is over 75% of email clients.
Exactly. So a really quick intro to how to actually type out a media query. It's super easy. We just type out in the style tag of our email, which is located in the head of the code, at media only screen is going to open up that query and define the environment, and the max width of 600 pixels, like I mentioned, is going to be that rule that needs to be met. Then within that rule, we're going to have our class. And to start a class, it's as simple as dot and then the class name mobile-table. And for this example, we're trying to take a 600 pixel wide table, make it 100% width, no matter what screen width it's viewed on. And then once we have that class and we've we know that the rule is there and consistent, we're going to actually append it to the HTML element. And for this example, like I mentioned, the table, which was previously 600 pixels, when it's viewed on a device that is equal to or less than 600 pixels, this mobile table class will apply, and that 600 pixels will be overridden with 100%. And this is just a quick example of what that looks like before and after. So without that media query, on the left-hand side, you see when the window scales down, nothing is happening, our content's being cut off, our buttons being cut off. But on the right side, with our media query, as it scales down, the table actually responds to the screen size and is being adjusted to 100%.
So just to follow along here, so the example on the left is a non-responsive version of the email. So if the screen size gets smaller, nothing really happens. Your content just rolls off the right side of the page. What happens on the right side version, which includes the media query, is as the screen size gets smaller, the content is adapting to the size of the screen. So you're seeing that it's nicely stacking on top of each other. The button is nicely laid out and filling up the size of the screen. You see the Code Perfect logo filling up the entire width of the screen as well. So it's just the content in your email changing to the side of the screen. So in this next section, we're going to talk about, so coding responsive emails can sometimes take a long time, specifically in the coding and testing phase. So we had to develop ways to get emails coded quicker. And what I was thinking about is cutting hours off that process, and specifically cutting hours off the process of creating a responsive email, then testing it in our testing tool, and then going back and forth to adjust our code. So we're going to talk about ways that we were able to cut down time in that process so that we could focus our time and attention on the content and the strategy of the emails, as opposed to spending so much time just on coding.
And one of the ways that we've been able to accomplish that is actually building templates that we reuse over and over again. So GetResponse found that 66% of marketers claim to have implemented those mobile optimized templates, and they'll build it once and they'll have a bunch of different versions of that emails or a couple different layouts, and they'll reuse parts that they need based on the content that they have for a particular email or email campaign, and they'll remove the code for all the other sections that they don't need. And although this is a great technique, since somebody who probably originally did not code the email could be in there now messing with the code. So there's that room for human error, and then that human error leads to broken code. And for example, you could be removing something that you actually needed for your particular template and you didn't notice it right away, or you could be pasting over something, or you don't have a closing tag or something along those lines. And those little inconsistencies can be duplicated across multiple templates, and then they stack up over time. And what happens is that you're actually spending a lot of time trying to figure out what those mistakes were. We have to continue going back and forth testing, figuring out what actually went wrong, what we need to do to fix it. So although having those mobile optimized templates works for a lot of people, like I mentioned, we still have those opportunities for human error, which could end up breaking the code. So we wanted to try to figure out a solution to try to fix that.
And what caught my attention on this stat is the part at the end. 18% of marketers have templates that support dynamic content, which enables you to personalize each email. Sorry, only 18% of marketers have that. So it's really important here that your template works for the type of content that you have. If you have content that does use dynamic content, that does use personalization, you need a responsive template that can support that. Too many times I hear from email marketers that they were able to find a template online that they're using. Yeah, but does that template actually support what you're trying to do with your emails? Does it support the content? Does it support the personalization? It's really important to have email templates and have a modular approach which does support the type of content that you're going to use. So having said that, the approach that we were able to come up with to our problem, our challenge of coding and testing, is coming up with software which we call Code Perfect. It started as an internal tool, and what the internal tool was intended to be was a way for us to do all of the testing and coding up front before we started building any emails. Basically just creating snippets and code modules that we could reuse over and over and over again to make the process of creating email a lot quicker. Because ultimately what we found is before we implemented this approach, we were spending up to 10 hours on each email doing the coding and testing. After we implemented this approach, that time got cut down drastically. And it's basically because we're doing all of that coding and testing on the front end and then just reusing the code modules that we've already established. So we found internally that it was a really effective tool. We started using it on a daily basis, and we just found that we got much more efficient at creating emails. And like I said a couple slides ago, we were able to focus more of our attention on personalization, data, strategy, and content, as opposed to spending so much time going back and forth with our coding and testing. So at this point, we're going to go into a demo of Code Perfect and what it looks like today. So what we're going to try to build quickly in this live demo, and where what I'm logged into right now is IBM Watson campaign automation. But Code Perfect can work on any ESP or any marketing automation tool. It just has to be a tool where you can edit the source code. And what we're trying to do here is build this email that we've already built out. So we're showing you the final product first, and then we're going to delete all this content, and we're going to rebuild it here within minutes. So Chris, walk me through how we would do this in Code Perfect.
Yeah, so the interface is supposed to be very intuitive and very easy to use. So on the left-hand side, you can see you start with a base template. And so typically when we're building our templates, we have a particular version that we're going to be reusing that comes with a header and a footer. Those oftentimes don't change very often. So like our logo and our social media links aren't going to be updated every single time. And even down in the footer, we kind of have like our copyright information, our address, our opt-out links, and contact us policy, all that. Those typically don't change. But what does change is the layout of the email that supports our content. And so for that particular example that we showed, Dan, if you want to start, the hero image was on top.
So I just clicked, and when I clicked, it added my hero image into the email template.
Yeah, and he's going to continue clicking to add the rest of the modules. And we had that full width text box, which was below the hero image, which followed up with a button. And then after that was a large call out.
So in this case, we already know the type of content that we want to include. We know that we have a large hero image, so we're including that. We know that we have some supporting text below it. And then we know that we have a little 2-column banner that we want to call out at the bottom. So here we've got our template ready to go, and then at the bottom of the screen here, you're seeing a copy HTML button. So I'm just going to copy that to my clipboard, and so I see I got a message there that's been copied to the clipboard. I'm going to go back to IBM Watson. I'm going to jump into the source code. So you see here we've got some empty source code on the screen. And then I'm going to paste in my code from Code Perfect. So as you can see here, that instantly generated a template for me in Watson. And so here I can see the desktop version. Desktop version looks nice. I'm going to scroll over to the mobile version. Mobile version looks good. And again, all of this has been tested out with our testing tool, which is Litmus, ahead of time so that we know it's going to render well. And then even if it's open on a different type of device like a tablet, we know it's going to look good as well. So then once you have that done, it's just a matter of plugging in your content. So in this case, we're going to swap out some of these images. So right here, we have a hero image that we need to put in. So I'm just going to take that from my desktop. I'm going to include my hero image. And here my hero image was originally 600 pixels wide. I'm going to adjust that down to 600. So that's going to fit nicely within my template. I'm going to put in my second image at the bottom. So just like I did before, I'm going to pull that from my desktop as well. And here I'm going to use this grid image that I had selected. And again, I've got to adjust the size of it to fit my template. So I'm adjusting it down to 290. So there it fits really nicely into my template. And now it's just a matter of putting in my text content. So here, I just have it in a text editor. I'm going to copy and paste it in. And this is all content that you can pull from a creative brief. If you're creating a creative brief for any of your emails, it's really easy to go in and just copy and paste that content. And then we're just pulling in all the content. And so here, we're almost done. Within minutes, we've created a Code Perfect email. We created it very quickly in the Code Perfect tool. And then we've got an email that's ready to go, that's been tested in Litmus, and we're just going to show you what it looks like in Litmus across all of these devices. So these are all of our desktop devices and all of our mobile clients. We've got Code Perfect email that's rendering. So it takes away a lot of the fuss of creating and testing emails. You can have it created in Code Perfect, and then you're ready to roll in any ESP that you're using. So in the example that we showed here, we had a simple example where we only have 10 modules. You can have much more than 10. You can have as many as you'd like. You can have more complicated modules like video modules and email carousel modules. It's just a matter of making the content and Code Perfect fit what you're trying to do in your email.
Yeah, and as you can see, that you don't really need to be an email specialist or a coding specialist for this to work for you. Just about anybody in your department would be able to come in and be able to pick this up, and it's going to be very easy for you to use. Just a couple different clicks, and that code is actually going to be generated for you. So then you don't even really need to rely on being in the code hardly ever. You just use any sort of WYSIWYG editor. So for instance, we saw the Watson example. We were just using the WYSIWYG editor to copy and paste content in there and just upload our images.
And Chris and I are part of the team who has been working on creating Code Perfect. And like what we are ultimately trying to create is a tool that for someone who doesn't know HTML at all, that they'd be able to create Code Perfect emails. And that's what we feel like we created. So that was our Code Perfect demo. Just a couple last things to mention on Code Perfect before we move on to the questions portion of the webinar. Just like I said, it works on any ESP. It just has to have the ability to have a source code editor, or you can import it using a zip file. If it has either of those two things, you can use it in that ESP. And then if you want more information on Code Perfect, you can visit codeperfect.com, or you can contact sales@whereoware.com for a personal demo and pricing. So having said that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nora for questions.
Thanks so much, Dan and Chris. That was a great webinar. If you missed it at the beginning, we will be sending out the slides and the webinar recording and an updated responsive email checklist in the email either today or tomorrow. You can also check on the blog for it later this week. So with that, I'm just going to kick off the questions here that we've been getting. So since we left off with Code Perfect, we'll go with this one. Does Code Perfect work with Eloqua?
So I don't personally have experience with Eloqua specifically, but I'd imagine Eloqua has a simple HTML editor. And like I said before, if you can copy code into a source editor like the one I showed on IBM Watson campaign automation, it'll work. You just have to have the ability either to copy and paste in the code or pull from a zip file with the code in it. Either of those two ways will work.
Okay, awesome. Let's go to another question here. For Outlook, since it doesn't support responsive code, is there anything we can do to make it responsive?
Unfortunately, that's one of the pains that we face every day in email marketing. So because Outlook is behind and doesn't support these media queries, unfortunately, there's not much we can do about it. We can try something along the lines of a scalable technique where we have everything already in a single column layout so that when you do open it in the Outlook application, it looks as though it's really responsive, but just when it comes down to it, Outlook just isn't going to be able to support it.
And just to follow up on that, like Outlook in the past 2 years has gotten more involved in the email community, and they've showed an interest in improving their tools, specifically as they go more to a web-based tool like on webmail and mobile apps. I feel like it's coming. It's not here yet, but I'm hopeful that here in the near future, we'll see some changes there.
Great. Okay, does it make sense to no longer use a view in browser because responsive design is a solution having to do that, like to having to open it in browser in your browser?
What we've been doing with a lot of our emails here at Whereoware is actually move the view in browser link to the bottom of our emails. We always like to have it as a way to test our emails, so we like having it in our emails, but we also understand that it takes up valuable real estate within the email itself. So in those cases, just like I showed those examples where we're moving the navigation down to the bottom of the email, we also move the view in browser link down to the bottom as well. And it ends up taking up room in the footer along with our email preferences link, our unsubscribe link. It's all down there. And I don't think that we're the only ones doing that. I think there's a lot of email marketers out there following a similar strategy. So if you don't want to take up that valuable real estate at the top, it's simple enough just to move it down to the bottom of the email.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we also want to keep in mind that some of these email clients will not display images by default. So when somebody opens an email and those images aren't being displayed, you'll see the alt text behind it, but that view in browser link gives them the opportunity to actually see that full email, see what those images look like to get that better viewing experience.
Awesome. Would you recommend having the predominant call to action above the fold? Would it increase the click rate if it is above the fold?
My personal opinion is that I do like to have it above the fold, but keep in mind that there's so many different email clients and so many different devices at this point that it's hard to define what the fold actually is. And there's some people that argue that there is no fold just because of the variety of email devices and email clients. As I would describe it as much as you can get that call to action above the fold, it's a good thing. It's hard to gauge exactly where that fold is, but it's all about the valuable real estate at the top of the email. And like I was talking about before, your users only really interact with your emails for 2 seconds or less when they're scrolling through your inbox. So if you can get your point across and show a call to action above the fold, it's a much better situation than having your users have to scroll down and go looking for it.
Yeah, so like the easier it is for somebody to take action on your email, the better it is going to be for you. So like Dan mentioned, it's tough to say where that fold actually is, but if you can try to front load your email and have the value of that email closer to the top, you're going to have much better chances of people engaging and clicking through.
Awesome. So I know we talked a lot, obviously, about responsive design, but what do you guys think about coding email as fluid design rather than responsive?
So for the fluid design, we see that we kind of group that together with a scalable design, so that way you still have those mobile-friendly techniques, but unfortunately it's just not going to be 100% responsive, so you won't be able to have those multiple email versions. And it's just not going to be responding to your device like it would with a regular responsive email. So for us, we typically try to say, if you can do responsive email, certainly do it. But those other options like scalable or fluid or mobile friendly, those are still good options if mobile responsive is out of the question for you.
Awesome. Is there a point to having a responsive email if my website isn't responsive?
So this is a tough question, and I'm glad somebody asked it. What the question comes down to is giving your users a good experience, and always having a better experience regardless of what the platform is, whether it's your email or your landing page. that is always better. I would say that having an uneven experience like that is not ideal. And if I was in that person's position, I would be working toward like getting a responsive website. But in the absence of that, you can also like create individual responsive landing pages, just so that they have a good place to click off of from the email, depending on the content of the email. I'll always try to be better. If the best you can do is just have a good email experience, but the website is still lagging behind, that's fine. That's better than having 2 bad experiences. I would just say get to work on improving each one individually. In my mind, that is better than just having 2 bad experiences. But I'm sure you'd have different people look at that different ways.
So we talked a lot about and showed a lot of examples of e-commerce companies, but someone's wondering if their business is not an e-commerce company, they're a services company, what have you, do they still need to have a responsive design?
I would say yes, unless they pulled the analytics for their particular company and they're saying that over 90% of their opens are on Outlook. In that case, it's like it's less important than obviously like a B2C e-commerce client example. But what's important is just knowing what you're dealing with. I showed the example where, well, I showed the litmus stat that 54% of all email opens are occurring on mobile devices. Like, there's a lot of different types of companies out there. They have very different looking analytics. So it really depends on what yours look like. But at this point, the case of the client that is purely B2B services where everybody's opening on Outlook, those cases are extremely rare. I think in the worst cases, you're still seeing like 20 or 30% of opens occurring on a mobile device, even in a B2B services example. So even in that case, I'm not leaving a third of my customers. I'm not leaving their opportunity on the table. I'm going to improve the experience. I'm going to focus on mobile, and I'm going to get that third of my customers that currently right now are not having a good mobile experience.
And that's also a good opportunity to incorporate some of these other techniques like the scalable or mobile friendly or fluid techniques. So that way, although it's not going to be responsive for those individuals that are opening it on Outlook, like web app, for example, it still is a better user experience than the example that we originally showed where things were being cut off. You would have to pinch and view to scroll in, or like columns were stacking next to each other. So that's just something to keep in mind. If it really just depends on the analytics for that particular person and what the majority of their readers are opening their emails on.
Great. We got a couple other questions, but they're a little more unique to each user. So we'll follow up with, if you ask a specific question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. But with that, it looks like we are through all general questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for the webinar. And keep an eye out for the email that should be coming out either today or tomorrow with the follow-up items. And keep an eye out for our next webinar.